Let me then just go right into introducing our next speaker, Professor Olivier de Weck. He's an international leader in systems engineering research, and he focuses on how complex man-made systems such as aircraft, spacecraft, automobiles, printers, and critical infrastructures are designed, manufactured, and operated, and I think importantly, how they evolve over time. His main emphasis is on the strategic properties of these systems that have the potential to maximize life cycle value. And so his group has developed quantitative models and tools that explicitly consider things like manufacturability, flexibility, robustness, and sustainability. These methods have impacted complex systems in many, many different domains, including space exploration with NASA, oil and gas exploration with BP, sophisticated electromechanical products with companies such as Xerox and GM, many other opportunities as well. Ollie's authored 2 books and more than 250 peer-reviewed papers. From 2008 to 2011, he was the associate director of MIT's Engineering Systems Division. Then from 2011 to 2013, relevant to today's talk, he served as executive director of the MIT Production in the Innovation Economy Project, which Liz made some mention of. And more recently, he was named faculty co-director of the Gordon MIT Engineering Leadership Program. Ollie, over to you, and thank you.
So what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is give you a summary, essentially, of the finding of the PI study. The PI stands for Production in the Innovation Economy, and this study looked at very similar questions to the current future of labor study, but a bit more from a technological perspective. And this is the flavor I want to give you here, is some of the key findings from PI regarding advanced technologies in manufacturing, but we will also ask the question, is this all still relevant in a post-COVID-19 world? So the study itself took place from 2011 to 2014. This was initiated by our former president, Susan Hockfield. If you remember 2008, 2009, 2010, those were also very, very tough years. And some of the outsourcing of manufacturing that some of the questions were about were a trigger for this particular study. There were 2 books that came out from it, and I'll mention those in a few minutes. The key question at the heart of the PI study was a little different from the current study. The question was, do we even need manufacturing in the US to still remain innovative? To secure our innovation pipeline in the future. So what's the link between upstream innovation and downstream manufacturing? And so we analyzed the prospects of new manufacturing technologies and approaches in depth. So I'm gonna just show a couple of minutes of a video here. Hopefully it comes through okay, just to set the stage for what PI was all about. We won't watch the whole video, it's about 7 minutes. So just the first couple of minutes.
Back in the 80s, the country was struggling with quality of manufacturing and leadership in manufacturing in the country. MIT put together a commission to look at these problems and make recommendations about how corporate America could more efficiently and more effectively engage in manufacturing.
The real question of the Made in America Industrial Productivity Commission was, what's gone wrong in the United States? Why is it that productivity is growing so slowly?
Many of the recommendations of the book Made in America were incorporated by corporate America, and it had a big impact.
One of the first lessons was that a nation, in order to live well, needs to produce well.
In the United States, we have some specific challenges that we didn't have 20 or 30 years ago. We have seen a large departure of manufacturing starting in the 1980s, but really accelerating between 2000 and 2010. We lost 6 million manufacturing jobs in the United States, from 18 million down to 12 million between 2000 and 2010. That is due to a combination of increases in productivity and outsourcing.
The question is really, what is it that we need to do What do we need to produce in order to have the strengths that we think are possible for a country with a population as dynamic as ours and with the kind of innovative capabilities that we have in the United States?
The MIT production in the... Okay, I hope that came through okay. So you see the current study on labor is really the third in a string of studies in recent decades that MIT has done, each with a somewhat different focus. So the Made in America study focused really on productivity. We got a lot of productivity increases, but some of those led to outsourcing then. And so how much manufacturing and what kind of manufacturing to remain innovative was the focus of the PI study. And the current study really looks on the impact on labor in particular. So when we structured the PI study, we really thought of it as a complex system. And you can see here the three major domains that we looked at. So upstream, we have innovation. So this is essentially R&D, which of course happens in universities and existing firms. It tends to cluster regionally, but also entrepreneurship and startups are very important. So I saw Fadi Saad, for example, in the audience. He runs a robotics cluster, a robotics enterprise here in Boston, and that's particularly the environments where innovation happens. Then production is really anchoring in a big part of the economy, and not to forget that we have a lot of services that are supporting manufacturing. So these are manufacturing-related services that would go away when manufacturing goes away. And then the larger part of the economy, of course, is non-manufacturing-related services. And then the question here on the right is the impact on the economy, including job growth, income distribution, and labor relations. So the PI study looked at different aspects, different modules. The one that I want to focus on is the one that I led, which was on the advanced manufacturing technologies. And so this is the interplay between production and innovation upstream. In terms of the methodology that we pursued for this particular type of the study, we looked far and wide. We actually started with an MIT internal scan, and I want to show you some of the results of the internal scan. We did an external survey and literature review, and we also conducted over 200 interviews with different companies in different sectors. And then I'll talk about the integration of those findings. So the internal scan at MIT, we basically looked in all departments. MIT has about 30 departments, labs and centers. And the question was, who's really doing research in manufacturing? And that seems like a simple question, but the answer is surprisingly complex, because what do you count or consider to be manufacturing-related research is not so simple. So we took a relatively inclusive approach, and we found 147 PIs, principal investigators, doing research in manufacturing. And so just to give you an order of magnitude, MIT has about 1,000 faculty. That's been pretty stable over recent decades. So this is roughly 15 to 20% of our PIs manufacturing related. And you can see here that it's quite broadly spread out in different disciplines and different departments as well. I'm just going to stop my video here for a second. So we can see that the Sloan School of Management, of course, mechanical engineering, this is what we expect, but also EECS, the Engineering Systems Division, chemical engineering, and many other units, total 19 units out of 300 have manufacturing related activities. We did an initial grouping of those manufacturing technology areas. And so you can see here a list of 24 initial technology manufacturing areas. And we did an initial grouping that we ended up revising, as I will show you. And so looking upstream, new materials, multi-scale manufacturing, manufacturing process innovation, but also the area of measurement and testing is very, very important. So that was our initial grouping. And this chart here shows you a bit of a collage, if you want, of some of the manufacturing. For example, continuous manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. So going away from large plants that manufacture in batch, going essentially to to smaller scale manufacturing, smaller batches, more flexibility, new kinds of manufacturing in biology using biological materials, a lot of work in energy storage, new types of batteries, creating biofuels from biology. So the use of biology and chemistry in manufacturing in a new way is really been a big trend, and where MIT has been a leader. But also new types of electronics, moving away from the traditional silicon-based chips, MEMS-based manufacturing, of course, organic, photovoltaics, 3D printing, some of the things that Liz talked about. So Professor Julie Shaw and her lab are a leader in human-robot collaboration, but also innovation in the big picture. How do supply chains, RFID was mentioned, so the Internet of Things, those all were found as well. And even though this collage here is from some years ago, many of these groups are still very active and continuing in very much the same direction. So what we found from the internal scan is in fact that there is a critical mass of manufacturing-related research at MIT, and this continues. A lot of this research is motivated by real problems in industry, non-incremental, and funded by a mix of federal and private research dollars. Also lots of collaborations internally and externally. And so based on what we found, we decided to regroup these manufacturing technologies in a way that seemed more logical to us and more in tune with major research thrusts. And so those are the 7 areas. I'm going to go through them in a little bit of detail. So we have the whole area of nanoengineering of materials and surfaces. So one of the big things that happened, of course, very recently is the creation of MIT Nano, which now has its own building and a very impressive facility. So this is about the synthesis of multifunctional materials at the nanoscale and from the ground up. Then additive precision manufacturing, so the 3D printing, different kinds of 3D printing with higher and higher levels of precision. The third group is all about robotics, automation, and adaptability. So using robotics to either substitute or, as we're seeing more and more, complement human labor in new ways. New types of electronics. So this is non-silicon-based electronics, maskless processes, but also printing electronics onto flexible substrates. The next area is biomanufacturing and pharmaceuticals. So the continuous manufacturing of small molecules, turning cells into small factories. Next, we have distributed supply chains and design, distributed design, moving away from large centralized supply chains. This is very relevant today in the COVID-19 crisis. And then finally, the last area we call the green sustainable manufacturing. So new manufacturing processes that use a minimal amount of energy, recycle materials, and minimized waste and emissions. So what we'd like to do now quickly is to do a quick poll among those of you that are with us. And so my question to you is, of these 7 areas which are reproduced here in the poll, which of these areas is the closest to your interests and your area of focus? So you can only pick one. So pick the one that's closest to what you're working on or what you're interested in. And we'll give you a few seconds to respond. Okay, we're at 60%. Okay, so we have an interesting. Well, the good news is we have a little bit of everything here. So we have every cluster is represented, and it looks like the robotics, automation, and adaptability cluster has almost a third of our participants. But it's really great to see this variety, and I believe that the fact that we have such a broad posture, and we're not only focusing on one particular area, such as, for example, automotive manufacturing is very important, aerospace is very important in this country, but it's this diversification that really gives us a lot of strength. So thank you for responding to the poll, and I'm gonna move on now. So one of the questions then was, well, where will we go? What do these new manufacturing capabilities actually enable? And so we believe there's 3 answers to this. One is well, entirely new products that we don't really have today, or we didn't have 5 or 6 years ago. And so examples of that would be new silicon-based semiconductors, wearable electronics, so electronic devices, not just our phones, but electronics that are embedded into our clothing, into our various everyday products, new drugs and fuels from biology. And we're certainly seeing some of those emerge. New MEMS actuators, piezo-based, for example, miniaturized propulsion for microsatellites. You're all aware of the CubeSat revolution, I'm assuming. And in fact, we have more and more satellites that are smaller and smaller being launched, and many of those have propulsive capabilities. And so the potential here is to create entire new industries, or at least niches that didn't exist 5 years ago. The second is what we call programmable manufacturing processes. So as you're aware, a lot of classic manufacturing is very capital intensive. It requires a lot of tooling and fixtures. And so moving away, not entirely, of course, but shifting more to programmable manufacturing has been interesting and has in fact been happening. So the prevalence of 3D printing, the ability to manufacture things on demand. Big questions though remain. Can we guarantee the tolerances and the quality level that we need? Are we in fact moving to a more distributed form of manufacturing away from large mega factories? And so here the examples are the 3D printing, also maskless nanolithography and other processes. And then the third area is, of course, enhancing the productivity and flexibility of existing large-scale manufacturing. Large-scale manufacturing hasn't gone away. We still have it in the US to some extent. We have it in China, we have it in Europe, and in other nations around the world. And so this is where RFID tracking of parts comes in. So having full visibility into manufacturing processes, into your inventory levels, the recycling of aluminum, human-robot collaboration, and flexible automation. So those are the major three impacts of these technologies. The caveat is, and I believe that this is also what Liz Reynolds said in the prior session, is none of these actually lead to a lot of new jobs. However, new jobs are being created, and those that are being created are meaningful, and they require high skills and knowledge. So moving on to the external survey and the literature search that we conducted. So we did a survey of major programs in manufacturing in the United States, and these are the responses that we got. So fairly good representation across the nation, 34% response rate. And so we essentially asked, one of the questions we asked, and this was a kind of unbiased question, which technologies or innovations have the greatest potential to lead to new manufacturing and production in the future? And I'm going to summarize what we heard. And so you see each column here, each of these 5 columns color-coded is a particular area of manufacturing. And to cut to the chase, this was almost an exact mirror of what we found at MIT in terms of those 7 areas. And so I'm just going to go through a little bit more detail here. Additive and precision manufacturing, 3D printing at home. My son is a first-year MIT student. He has two 3D printers running, and he's been printing PPE like a week after MIT shut down the campus. So definitely 3D printing at home is a real thing, even in my house right now. Rapid prototyping, integrating CAD, injection molding, smaller MOSIS-like factories, laser-based manufacturing, and sintering and forming technologies for aluminum, titanium, nickel-based alloys. The next cluster, materials and nano manufacturing, so large area graphene production. I think you're aware that graphene is a very promising new development. The European Union has a major flagship project in graphene. Roll-to-roll manufacturing, 3-dimensional integrated circuits, continuing to improve fiber composite materials, and nano etching. The third area is robotics and automation, and we have a lot of people in this session in that area. So intelligent, smart automation, embedded sensors, reconfigurable robotics, human-robot collaboration, wireless real-time sensing, and then also network control for telerobotics. So being able to control robots from a distance. The fourth area is this new kind of electronics. So UV-based nanolithography, multifunctional devices, new ways for humans to interface with computers through touch, voice, also brain-computer interfaces, the wireless revolution, 5G. You know, 5 years ago, 5G was not fully deployed, and we're really moving fast now into 5G. And then the flexible substrates. Green and efficient manufacturing, so new energy sources, solar PV, concentrated solar power, the natural gas revolution, waste to energy, new battery storage technologies. Also, supercapacitors are emerging to replace batteries. We're still just at the beginning of that. Capturing power within plants, manufacturing plants, and then remanufacturing and recycling. And then the whole area of biomanufacturing, which is very important, of course, in the Boston area, stem cell-based manufacturing, human organ engineering, regenerative medicine, and tissue engineering. And then supply chain design, so community-based design, decentralized supply chains, cloud computing for computer-aided design, computer-aided engineering, and computer-aided manufacturing. So the good news here was very much a corroboration of what we had found at MIT and a very similar grouping compared to the one in the MIT scan. We also asked people to rank, you know, which of the areas did they think were most promising. And so this is on a 5-point scale. You see ranked in decreasing order, these different manufacturing technologies. The consensus was that smart automation, precision manufacturing, you know, advanced sensing and robotics was absolutely in the top group. So general agreement that research and deployment automation and robotics is absolutely critical. And another interesting finding is that there were some areas with less consensus, so with a standard deviation greater than 1. So for example, you know, how much are supply chain and logistics technologies really important? Some people really believe that they're critical, others less so. The role of rapid prototyping. Remember, the question in PI was the link between innovation and manufacturing. And then, for example, this notion of flexible electronics. So the electronics that can be printed on flexible substrates, is that really a new market or not? I think some of that is still playing out today. Okay, so the next thing we did was, of course, to speak to companies. We interviewed many companies in different sectors and asked them about the role of manufacturing technology and what are really the new things, the needs, not simply based on push, on research, but more needs-based pull in terms of these manufacturing technologies. There are 5 examples here of companies that we interviewed and what we heard from them. So Cisco is one of the very important companies in networking. So things like remote networking, sensing, and teleoperation of manufacturing plants, providing real-time visibility, separating command and control from the physical operations. And so some of that is absolutely continued. Alnylam, a company focused on RNA interference technology. So the idea that you can suppress diseases at the source rather than just suppressing the symptoms. Michelin is very well known, of course, for its manufacturing of tires. And so how to manufacture in a global context using new technologies and processes. Cambrian Innovation, some of you might not know this company. It's a smaller company, but it's been around for a decade now. They produce electricity from wastewater and also produce other value-added products like oxygen, methane from active biofilm technology. And then finally, 1366 Technologies working on new kinds of photovoltaics. And so what we see for each of these companies, whether well-established or new, a very good mapping to those 7 areas: the smart automation, small batch pharmaceuticals, new materials and nanotech, biological manufacturing, and then of course the additive manufacturing. I did mention the two books that came out of the PI study. So one of them, Making in America, which was Suzanne Berger was the lead author on this, which is more of an overview, and then an edited volume called Production and the Innovation Economy that has a lot more of the details and also the quantitative findings. And I believe the ILP will provide the links for you to find these books. They're both published by MIT Press. Okay, so to finish up, the question is, what is the real impact of these technologies on manufacturing back then and today and in the future? So here's my very simplistic sort of traditional view of what a manufacturing plant looks like. I think it's still pretty much true that you have a flow, starts at the top, you have raw materials coming in, perhaps you're warehousing some of those to make sure you have a buffer. You have parts fabrication or your individual components with Q&A. You have supplier buffers for supplied parts, intermediate products, so to speak. You have assembly, you have final inspection, and then you have your finished goods. And of course, we have inputs of raw materials, energy, supplied parts, labor, and then information. And we're producing things like scrap emissions, and then of course the value-added finished goods. And that, that has sort of been the classic view of manufacturing. So the question is, how are these new technologies changing that view, and what are the trends? And so we had a very active debate around, what does it mean, advanced manufacturing? And so let me try to explain what our view is of this. Traditional manufacturing, a linear process from raw materials all the way to finished products. We're very familiar with that. And we still have, of course, we still take raw materials from nature in the 21st century. We still have fabrication, we still have assembly, but there's a few things that are quite new and different, qualitatively different. So one is this area of material design. So increasingly, we don't just use raw materials, but we produce synthetic materials that are in fact themselves part of the design process. Material science and nanotechnology have contributed greatly to that. We also see a blurring of fabrication and assembly, a lot of continuous processes. And then the finished product these days is often not just a physical product that we sell, but it's actually an integrated solution where the physical product is bundled with services and software into a product service bundle. So the bundling is very important. And many firms told us about how important this bundling actually is. And then we have the recycling, recovering materials, and feeding those materials back either straight into fabrication or back into the material synthesis. So in fact, advanced manufacturing is a much broader view, and it's the creation of these integrated solutions that require, yes, physical artifacts, but coupled with value-added services and software, while exploiting, custom design or recycled materials and being ultra efficient throughout. So if we look at this enhanced view of advanced manufacturing, the question is, our 7 technology areas, where do they intervene? The additive and precision manufacturing, has a key role to play in fabrication, and that's really the sweet spot. The nanotechnology, materials design and nanotechnology, clearly in the upstream material design. Pharmaceutical and biomanufacturing focus both on the upstream material design at the component level, but also the continuous manufacturing processes. Robotics and automation, here the major impact is during the fabrication to some extent, but in a major way during assembly and also supply chain, of course. Advanced electronics, in embedding small chips, small sensors into the physical products, making our products smarter, and green and sustainable manufacturing also throughout, but in particular reusing materials and recycling them. And then finally, the whole area of supply chain design technologies, more at the tail end here of the process, but it's, providing cloud-based solutions, doing real-time monitoring, digital twins of products that customers can interrogate and use in different ways. So we can see that each of these technology areas has a very important role to play. So let me summarize and then just say a few comments about COVID before we move to the Q&A. So the summary of the PI findings, particularly in this area of technology, was that MIT and many other US universities continue to innovate in some of those key technology areas related to manufacturing. Some of these are potentially transformative and not just evolutionary. Research tended to cluster in those 7 areas. And we think these areas are somewhat orthogonal, complementary to each other, not a lot of overlap. Firms also innovate and pull key technologies to open new markets. And what we did find is that there was a need to come up with new models to enhance manufacturing research collaboration, both within universities, but also university industry partnerships. And so one of the things that has happened and worked particularly well is these new manufacturing innovation institutes. And several of these were created particularly, in the around 2014 to 2017, 2018, these manufacturing innovation institutes, both the federal government, state governments, and companies have pooled their money to create some of them. And I think they're success stories for the most part. The challenge will be to sustain them over the longer term. This is where countries like Germany with the Fraunhofer system have really an advantage because they have a very long-term view there. That I think these manufacturing innovation institutes were a really nice outcome. I think we don't claim credit for those as part of the PI study, but I think the PI study reinforced the need to invest in them. And so the PI study made some unique contributions to describing in really some detail how 21st century advanced manufacturing is really different and why it's so important in particular for the US. So a few words about COVID, and here I'm afraid that many of the things I'm going to say are somewhat redundant with what Liz has already said in the prior session, but maybe that's a good thing because it means we're finding very similar things. So it's a huge topic right now. What will manufacturing, the new normal, be like after COVID-19? And I think it's fair to say that the COVID-19 crisis has exposed some weaknesses in our manufacturing strategy and supply chains that were there, but were now really exposed in a very clear way. So the first thing I'd like to mention is the no domestic or very limited domestic capacity for certain drugs and certain PPE, personal protective equipment. And so this is not just a US problem. I think many European countries had also lost this domestic capacity. And it really, I think, forces a reassessment. Lean supply chain. So when your supply chain is extremely lean, you have very low buffers, very low inventory, any disruption, import-export bottlenecks can really hit you hard. So this is the ports. I don't know if you've seen pictures. There's, I think, over 20 tankers currently anchored outside of the port of Los Angeles, waiting to unload. The air traffic lockdown, which is primarily a lockdown in commercial passenger, cargo airplanes can still fly, but the air traffic being down has been a major, major disruption. Some companies have real trouble knowing what their inventory levels are in real time. That's an issue. And then I would say our ability to quickly ramp up or ramp down. I don't know, some of you might have seen the news, in the news yesterday. Clorox, for example, is a company that has had to ramp up their manufacturing a lot while other companies are trying to ramp down very quickly. So how do you ramp up and down your volumes while still maintaining profitability? Big challenge. The ability to run factory in a lights out mode. So running a factory with no people or only very few people is very important. And so some factories have that capability, others do not. And today is really when you would like to have it. Finally, of course, the big geopolitical question is the relationship between the US and China in the future. And so I think this crisis will exert additional pressure onto this relationship that goes beyond the trade war that was already ongoing. And then of course, some companies that rely on China as the sole source provider this will be questioned. Maybe the answer is, it's still the best solution in the end, even after this crisis, but at least some soul searching will have to happen. So I'm at the end of my remarks, and I'm happy to see if there's any questions or comments.
Let me, we've got some great questions here. Let me go through them sort of in the order of their importance. The first one is the same question that we asked to Liz at the end of her talk, and she wanted to punt to you anyway. So to what extent do you think the Internet of Things plays a role in future manufacturing? And do you think developing countries like India and Africa can cope with that technology full-fledgedly?
Yeah, I think that IoT, the IoT sector has been growing. So what is IoT? It's essentially sensors that you can embed at every step of the manufacturing chain that we saw, but also in warehousing and logistics, to know exactly what transaction is happening when. And so, RFID is an example, but it's really any sensor that gives you real-time knowledge. The sensors themselves are not just the only important thing, but it's also the back-end infrastructure. So the databases, the cloud-based, ability to access that information in real time and then push it out to the cloud, push it out to your customers. And so I think the cost of those technologies has been dropping dramatically. And so I think that both in India, Africa, developing nations, it's not so much the cost of those technologies, but it's the knowledge of them and the ability to actually access them. And so I view this more as an educational issue than a cost issue at this point, because a lot of the RFID solutions and IoT technologies have become so affordable. So I'm very optimistic, and it's more an educational issue in my mind. Excellent.
Okay. This one comes from Fady, who you name checked earlier in your conversation. What's the role of startups, especially robotics and AI ones, in upgrading our manufacturing capabilities? And how can we minimize the barriers for testing and adopting these technologies by manufacturers?
Yeah, great. Fady, it's great to have you on. And shout out here to Mass Robotics, which is really a great organization. There is a big role to play. I think what we've seen in robotics is a kind of specialization of robotics into different niches. So for example, robotics in hospitals, these are robots that have to be nimble. They have to be able to take elevators on their own. Surgical robots, of course, have been around for a while and have very, very high safety standards and hygiene standards. And they have to be acceptable to doctors, nurses, healthcare personnel. So there's so many specialized requirements for robotics in the healthcare sector that, a general robotics company wouldn't be successful. And so, we're seeing, and then robotics for logistics, of course. Many of you are familiar with the company called Kiva Systems, which is now Amazon Robotics. And so we have really a need to specialize, and the risks are great, but the opportunities as well. So incubators like Mass Robotics can play a role. The teaming is very important, making sure that you don't reinvent the wheel, that you can rely on best-in-class actuators, sensors, software libraries. So I do see a big role for robotics, and prices coming down as well. But the key in the end is, are you actually working with the end users? Are you testing them and doing pilots in real environments, as opposed to a kind of protected lab where things work very, very well, and as soon as you move to the real world, with all its messy complexity, things fall apart. So the robotics cluster that we have here in Boston, I think is very promising, but we see it in other parts of the world as well.
Understood. Okay. We'll do a couple of more. This one is interesting as well, I think. Given the COVID-19 deglobalization context, is there innovation in transport technologies that will allow us to continue to decentralize manufacturing in synergy with the supply chain advances you mentioned?
Yeah, so the last mile problem, I don't know if you've seen, there's some grocery stores and some local stores that are deploying these vehicles that just drive along the sidewalk, and they, you program the address, they stop in front of your house, you get your groceries out, they go back. So not necessarily the drones, the delivery by drone, of course, but just much more basic autonomous vehicles that navigate along the sidewalks and so forth. We'll have to see. I mean, we're seeing some interesting experiments. Will those be cost effective? Perhaps, but it's interesting to see those pop up. So I think at a minimum, the COVID-19 crisis will spawn a great phase of experimentation.
Got it. Here's one that I think, wait a minute, I just moved away, but I want to ask this one to you because I know that this speaks to your background as well. Large part of the US manufacturing is in the defense sector. Are there specifics that set that sector apart, and can it be adapted to the civilian sector?
Yeah, so I think the defense sector has really been, the manufacturing in the defense sector has been relatively insulated, I think, certainly from the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, because the US government, the taxpayers ultimately are the customer for these systems. I have heard actually from I have a student, for example, who's graduating now with his master's. He's going to work at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. And what he's telling me is interesting, which is that they've been busier than before because some of the older workers, that maybe are more in danger now with the virus, have been working remotely, but some of the younger workers have been staying in the factory. And so they're actually busier than before. And so I think even for relatively low manufacturing volumes where you typically think that automation or at least robotic assistance don't make sense, well, if half your workforce has to stay home, now those robotic assistants are maybe actually valuable. And so I think even in defense manufacturing, despite the lower volumes, some of those technologies might make sense.
Right, good. Okay, we'll do one more, Ollie, and then we'll let you go. This one observes that the study is a few years old, the PI study, and the question is, with the rapid development of technology and consumer needs are changing, what's the view on these prioritized technology spaces today?
Mm-hmm. Well, I hesitate to give a blanket answer because I think that we would have to look at each of those 7 areas separately. I think some of the predictions are absolutely coming true. For example, if we look in the nanospace, the deployment of nanotechnologies for better surfaces, as nanotechnology becomes more widely adopted, the prices drop. I mean, I think that in many of these technologies, in the end, it becomes an economic question. It's no doubt that that these technologies perform supremely well, but to manufacturing 1 square inch of a hydrophobic surface using nanotechnology, if that cost is 10 times as much as a traditionally manufactured surface, nobody will buy it, or it has a very, very small niche application. So as the volumes for some of these technologies go up, their deployment also goes up. And so particularly in areas like nano, I'm very optimistic for what's happening with the vaccines now for COVID-19. Of course, we want those vaccines to be safe and not harm people. But I think the whole area of testing for viruses and bacteria, small batch or rapid manufacturing of drugs will get a huge boost now from COVID-19. That was one of our 7 areas. So that area I'm also very optimistic about.
You and I spoke the other day about machine learning and artificial intelligence as potentially a new cluster, although I remember you told me quite cogently that it's really something we've been doing for a long time. It's just become maybe buzzworded. But as thinking about that, there have been a rush of new companies getting into that space for manufacturing and automation purposes. And so do you think that that might increase the emphasis on AI and machine learning in manufacturing compared to what you anticipated in 2013?
You know, I think it's fair that we maybe didn't foresee the AI revolution as much as we could have. We did have an area, the whole information technology area, if you remember, was one of the top ranked one. So AI really is a sub-technology of information technology, and particularly when it comes to optimizing the scheduling, fine-tuning manufacturing processes, predicting consumer demand patterns. In those areas, AI can play a big role. You know, we're kind of in the euphoria phase right now, and that's a good thing. And I expect, you know, in 3 to 5 years, those applications of AI where there's real value added will become visible and consolidated.
Great. Okay. Ollie, if you have a minute, I'd like to get 1 or 2 more in.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. This one, with respect to conflict between US and China, do you expect most of the manufacturing to come back to the US? Or rather simply move to other countries like India, Vietnam, other countries in Southeast Asia?
You know, unless there's a major conflict, I don't think that, I do think this reassessment will occur. In the end, you know, the underlying economics will drive. And so we've seen the labor costs in China go up. I think Liz mentioned that. And so I think it's the companies that solely, exclusively rely on China for certain critical parts. They might move more to a dual source, you know, or triple source solution where you have some nominal capacities that you can adjust depending on, you know, on evolution of relative costs, a crisis in one part or the other of the world. Of course, there is cost to maintain that spare capacity, but I think it's going to be more of a rebalancing than an outright, you know, return of manufacturing. I mean, we do see some manufacturing jobs come back to the U.S., but I don't think it's going to be back to the level of 18 million manufacturing jobs that we had back in 2000. I don't expect that to return. And then anybody who promises that, I don't think is really realistic.
Here's another one that I have to ask because I know it speaks to your background. I'm going to have to scroll down a little bit. Bear with me here, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't find it, but it's basically about the impact of model-based engineering on manufacturing, and is that something that you see becoming more and more widespread? And I think for that, you'll probably have to give a very brief overview of what model-based engineering is for us uninitiated folks.
Sure. So I'd like to distinguish between model-based engineering and model-based systems engineering, MBSE. So model-based engineering is in each discipline, you know, structures, we've been using Nastran, finite element modeling, thermodynamics, thermal analysis with programs like CINDA. So the disciplinary siloed use of models at higher levels of fidelity, running these models faster, that's model-based engineering. And, you know, for example, in 3D printing, before you actually print a part, being able to simulate that part, including any defects or porosities, and then adjust your machine settings, even on a 3D printer, with the model running in the loop, that's model-based engineering, and we see that happening. Model-based systems engineering is the connection between the disciplines, where now manufacturing is more and more treated as a co-equal discipline to others like fluids, structures, controls, etc. And so a lot of companies are talking about co-design, which is where you're optimizing the manufacturing at the same time as the performance of the product. And so a trivial example is, where do you cut the product into modules, where the module boundaries are? That has a big impact on, potentially a big impact on performance, but an even bigger impact on how you manufacture and assemble it. And so co-designing, co-optimizing performance and manufacturability is absolutely now state of the art. And if you're not doing it, you're probably not a leader in your industry.
Right. Okay, this will be the last one, and it's somewhat related, and we'll pull out a little bit in terms of scope. But what will the role be of the digital twins you mentioned in the future of manufacturing?
So a digital twin is essentially in theory, it's actually an impossibility to have a model of your system. And we're talking serial number by serial number. Every product coming off the line is a little different. There's different tolerances, slightly different. So each product coming off the line has a virtual representation of it, where the digital twin, as the physical product was built or assembled, the digital twin was assembled digitally at the same time. So both come off the line at the same time. And so the customer buys a product while the digital twin is also bought at the same time. And then as the product is being used, some products age more than others. Some products have failures and are repaired. All those actions are mirrored in the digital twin. The big wins are in areas like predictive maintenance. Before the product fails, there's impending signs that a failure could happen, and you can actually intervene in the product before it happens. And so that's the vision here. And we have, for example, a thesis that I'm co-supervising by Chevron in this area of digital twin in energy production, oil and gas manufacturing. There's a lot of interest in industries, even in more traditional industries, in terms of what a digital twin can actually give you. But the devil's in the details. So it sounds great, but you have to really define what it is and how close a digital twin should be to the real physical system.
I think much like the AI and machine learning, there's been such a great interest in digital twins in energy and other manufacturing applications that there are startups now appearing that are working on that. And it's a great pathway for MIT technology to get out into the world through those startups. So great for
absolutely
sponsoring one of your students. Well, Ollie, with that, I'll thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak on many of the topics upon which you're expert. I hope that we can see you again sometime in the very near future.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. And I see that we still have about 300 participants. So it's a long 2 hours. We're all zoomed out, I think. Zoom fatigue is a new thing. And I really want to thank all of you that hung in there for the second hour. So thank you.
Indeed, right. So yes, I'd like to echo Ollie's thanks. Let me just make a few comments. The videos and slides from these presentations will be up on our ILP website. That's ilp.mit.edu in the near future, and we'll certainly let you know. We also are going to keep the chat open on this webinar for a while so that you can provide your feedback to us. We really appreciate that. I want to thank Mike Lawson and his communications team from MIT Communications for facilitating this webinar and making sure everything went smoothly. Thank you very much, Mike and Kayla, Katrina, Kwan, and Margaret. And then let me also just let you know that we continue our series of webinars here in MIT Corporate Relations. The next one in this vein will be May 14th next week, titled COVID-19 and Crisis Management, and it's on business resilience. And all of this is a continuously evolving slate of webinars that we're offering. Go to our website. Again, it's ilp.mit.edu for the latest and greatest in the webinars that we're providing. I'll sign off then. Thanks again very much, and we look forward to seeing you next week at the next webinar.